I can't believe it. This is too much.
He is on his knees in the dirt. His hands are cracked and calloused. The kind of hands that tell you everything about the life a man has chosen, or the life that chose him. Hands that have gripped the handle of a push mower in the dead heat of a July afternoon. That have pulled weeds from clay soil until the fingers go numb. That have planted things in the earth and watched them grow without ever once asking for recognition. There is sweat at the back of his neck. His jeans are faded at the knee and stained a deeper shade that no amount of washing has ever quite lifted. He is trimming roses along the edge of a modest two-story home on a quiet street in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Nobody is watching him except a woman at the kitchen window. Her name is Carol. She has a coffee cup in both hands and a quiet smile on her face. And she is looking at her husband the way a person looks at something they are completely certain of. With the easy, unguarded confidence of someone who has nothing left to wonder about. She is certain she knows everything about this man. She is certain of his rhythms and his habits and his values and his history. She is certain of who he is at 7 in the morning and who he is at midnight and every unremarkable hour in between. She has been married to him for 12 years. She has raised 2 children with him. She has worried about money with him and saved with him and stretched a budget with him on more evenings than she can count. She knows him. She is absolutely, completely, with total confidence, wrong. Because the man kneeling in that garden, the man with dirt under his fingernails and a hole in the right knee of his jeans, the man who packed his own lunch every single morning and drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and never once suggested they take a vacation they could. Not easily afford, that man is worth $11 million, not someday, not in theory, not on paper in some complicated arrangement that would take a team of accountants to decode. $11 million, sitting in accounts and properties and carefully managed investment portfolios that Carol Mercer has never seen, never heard of, and never had a single reason to suspect existed. He has been a millionaire for most of their marriage. He was a millionaire before she ever said his name, and in 12 years of sharing a bed and a kitchen table and a life, he never said a word. Before we go any further, before we get into who Daniel Mercer really is, before we get into what Carol found on that Tuesday morning in March, before we get into the letter that sat in an attorney's safe for 11 years waiting for a moment that almost never came, I need you to understand something about this story. This is not a story about a con man. It is not a story about a villain or a fraud or a man who built a secret life to escape the one he had. This is a story about a man who watched money destroy the most dignified person he ever knew, who made a quiet decision that it would never happen to him, and who loved a woman so completely that he spent 12 years lying to her every single day to protect what they had. It is the most complicated love story I have ever had to tell, and by the time it is over, I genuinely do not know which side you are going to be on. I am not sure which side I am on. Here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. When most of us hear the phrase, a husband who hid money from his wife, we know immediately what story we are in. We have heard that story. We know how it goes. There is a man who does not trust his wife, or who is planning to leave, or who has built a second life somewhere that requires funding, or who is simply selfish in the quiet, corrosive way that some people are selfish inside a marriage without ever making a single dramatic gesture that would give the whole thing away. We know that story and we know what to feel about it. But what happens when the details do not fit the template? What happens when the man hiding the money is not doing it to protect himself but genuinely, sincerely believes he is doing it to protect her? What happens when the secret is not a betrayal of the marriage but, in some difficult, uncomfortable, hard-to-defend way, an attempt to preserve it? That is the question at the center of Daniel and Carol Mercer's story. And before this video is over, you are going to have to decide where you stand, because this story is not going to decide for you. What I can tell you right now are the facts as they were eventually, painstakingly uncovered, by Carol herself, by her attorney, by the accountant who had kept Daniel's secrets for more than a decade, and by a letter written in the winter of 2005 that nobody except one quiet man in a small office in Clarksburg knew existed. The facts are these. Daniel Mercer, known to every person in his community as a self-employed landscaper and gardener, a man who drove used trucks and wore coats held together with safety pins and packed cheese sandwiches for lunch, was secretly one of the wealthiest private individuals in his county. He owned property in 3 states. He held investment positions in dozens of blue-chip companies, positions he had been building and holding for 3 decades, reinvesting every dividend, never selling in a panic, never boasting, never giving a single person in his life any reason to look twice at the man, with the dirt under his fingernails. And now, before we go any deeper into how all of this began, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your state, wherever you are in the world tonight. We would genuinely love to know how far this story travels. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because the stories we tell on this channel are not the kind you want to miss halfway through. All right, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand why Daniel Mercer did what he did, you have to understand where he came from. And where he came from explains almost everything. Harlan County, Kentucky. 1962, Daniel Ray Mercer was born on a Wednesday in August of 1962 in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is the kind of place that shapes a person so completely and so early that they spend the rest of their life either running from it or trying to get back to it. There is no middle ground with a place like Harlan County. The land is beautiful in the way that hard things are beautiful. Steep green ridges and creek hollows and a sky that sits close to the earth in a way that feels either protective or suffocating depending on the season and your state of mind. It was coal country, deep and proud and exhausted, a place where men went into the earth every morning and came home carrying something they could not entirely put down. Not just the coal dust that turned up in their handkerchiefs and got into the creases of their hands no matter how long they scrubbed. Something heavier than that. A tiredness that accumulated over years and settled in the spine and behind the eyes, the tiredness of a man who is working as hard as he possibly can and still not getting ahead, who can feel the gap between where he is and where he wants to be and cannot see a clear path across it. Daniel's father, Raymond Mercer, was that man. Raymond worked at a coal processing facility just outside the county seat for 22 years, not in the mines themselves, which Raymond considered a mercy, but in the processing plant where the hours were long and the conditions were loud and the pay was steady in the way that steady and modest are often the same word when you are talking about working men in eastern Kentucky in the 1960s and 1970s. Raymond was proud. That is the word that everyone who knew him used first and used most. He was a proud man who took care of his family, who fixed things himself rather than paying someone else to fix them, who paid his debts before he paid himself, who shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye and believed, with the sincere conviction of a man who had earned every dollar he ever had, that a person's character was the most valuable thing they owned, and that you protected it the way you protected anything else worth keeping, carefully, consistently, and at some personal cost. Raymond had 2 children. Daniel was the younger one by 4 years. From the time he was old enough to follow his father around the yard on Saturday mornings, Daniel watched Raymond with the particular attentiveness that younger children have for fathers, that total, unfiltered absorption of everything a man does and how he does it and what it seems to cost him. He watched Raymond fix the truck engine in the driveway on Sunday afternoons. He watched him balance the household accounts at the kitchen table on the first of every month with a mechanical pencil and a yellow legal pad, going through each number carefully and without drama, as though the numbers were facts to be respected rather than problems to be solved. He watched his father be the kind of man who made things work, and he absorbed, without being told directly, that making things work was the highest form of dignity available to a man in the circumstances they were in. The moment that changed everything, the trouble came when Daniel was 14 years old, and it came in the form of a man named Earl Denton, who had worked alongside Raymond at the processing plant for a decade, and who Raymond trusted the way you trust someone you have stood next to. Through 10 years of difficult days, completely, and without auditing the trust, because there had never been any reason to, Earl came to Raymond in the fall of 1976 with an opportunity. A small trucking business that Earl claimed to be starting with another partner, a man Raymond had never met and that needed a third investor to get off the ground. The buy-in was $3,000. Raymond would own a third of the business. The projections, as Earl laid them out on a folded piece of paper at Raymond's kitchen table one Thursday evening, were modest but credible. It was the kind of thing that working men dreamed about, a way out of the hourly wage, a piece of something that was your own, a chance to build rather than just maintain. Raymond took 10 days to think about it. He talked to his wife. He went over the numbers. He asked Earl a handful of careful questions, all of which Earl answered with what seemed like total transparency. And then Raymond Mercer did something that took genuine courage for a man in his position. He pulled $3,000 from the savings account that he had been building for 6 years. Dollar by careful dollar, money that was meant to be the beginning of something better for his family, and he handed it to Earl Denton. They shook hands. Raymond felt, for the first time in years, like a man who was going somewhere. The feeling lasted 11 days. That was how long it took for it to become clear that there was no trucking business, that the other partner Earl had mentioned did not exist, and that Earl Denton had taken Raymond's $3,000 and disappeared so completely that it was as though he had never existed at all. The money was gone. All of it. Every dollar of 6 years of careful, patient, disciplined saving. Daniel Mercer was 14 years old the night his father came home after confirming that the money was gone. He watched Raymond walk through the front door and go directly to the kitchen table and sit down. He did not say anything. He did not throw anything or raise his voice or make any of the gestures of a man in crisis. He just sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. Daniel stood in the hallway and watched his father for a long moment, and something happened in him in that hallway that he would not be able to articulate for 30 years, but that shaped every financial decision he ever made afterward. He did not decide consciously, in the way that 14-year-olds do not make conscious financial decisions, that he would be rich someday. What he decided was simpler and more durable than that. He decided that the people who knew you had money were a danger. That trust extended carelessly was a liability. That the only way to be safe from what had just happened to his father was to make sure that nobody knew what you had. Leaving Kentucky and learning to build, Daniel graduated from Harlan County High School in 1980 and left for West Virginia the following September with $40 in his pocket and a duffel bag that was not entirely full. He had no plan beyond getting distance from a county where everyone knew everyone and where the story of Raymond Mercer and the $3,000 had become the kind of cautionary tale that people told in a way that was meant to be sympathetic but always had a slight edge to it. The way that stories about other people's misfortunes always do when the people telling them feel safe from the same fate. Daniel did not want to be that story. He wanted to be somewhere no one knew his father's name. He spent his 20s working. Landscaping jobs at first because the work was available and because he was good with his hands and because being outside suited him in a way that office work never would have. He learned quickly that he could pick up clients reliably in the suburbs of mid-sized West Virginia cities, Clarksburg, Morgantown, Parkersburg, where homeowners had yards they did not have time to maintain and were willing to pay a fair rate for someone dependable, who showed up when he said he would and did the work properly. He built a small client base. He bought a used truck. He rented a room in a boarding house for 2 years and then a small apartment for the next 3. He spent almost nothing beyond what he needed to live. The investing began when he was 27 years old. Not because anyone told him to, not because he read a book that changed his thinking, but because he had accumulated a small amount of savings, about $4,000, coincidentally almost exactly what his father had lost. And he could not put it in a savings account without feeling that he was being too conservative with something that should be working harder. He bought his first shares of stock through a discount brokerage account, picking 3 companies that he had heard of, that had been around for decades and that he understood at a basic level what they made, who bought it, why people would keep buying it in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. He did not try to find the next big thing. He was not interested in the next big thing. He wanted the thing that was already proven, already established, already trusted by millions of people who were going to go on trusting it, regardless of what happened in the market on any given Tuesday. And then he waited. He added more money when he had it. He reinvested the dividends automatically, buying fractional additional shares every quarter, watching the position grow in the way that compound interest grows, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably, then in a way that started to feel almost alarming when he looked at the statements at the end of each year. By the time he was 35, his portfolio was worth $300,000. By 40, it had crossed $2 million. He owned his first piece of commercial property at 38, a modest strip of storage units outside Parkersburg that he had purchased for cash after 2 years of watching the neighborhood and concluding that the demand for storage would not be going anywhere. He was right. He was almost always right. Not because he was a genius, not because he had access to information that ordinary people did not have, but because he was patient in a way that almost no one is patient, and because he had never once, in 20 years of building, allowed himself to spend money trying to look like the kind of man he was quietly becoming. The only person who knew his name was George Atkins. He was a small-town accountant based in Clarksburg, a quiet, careful man in his late 50s who had been doing tax work for tradespeople and small-time business owners in the area for 30 years and who had a reputation for being so professionally discreet that he was sometimes described by his clients as the most boring man in town, which was meant as the highest possible compliment. Daniel had found George through a referral from a landscaping client, had met him once to establish the relationship, and had decided within that first hour that George was exactly the kind of person he had been looking for. Not a financial advisor, not a wealth manager, just an accountant who would handle the filings, keep the records clean, ask no personal questions, and tell no one anything. George had agreed to these terms without fanfare. He was not surprised by them. He had worked with private people before. George Atkins knew, by the year Daniel met Carol, that his client was worth somewhere between $4 and $5 million across his various accounts and holdings. He also knew, from the moment Daniel mentioned the woman he was seeing, that Daniel had no intention of telling her. George had asked once, professionally, briefly, as part of a conversation about estate planning, and the financial complications that marriage creates when one party has undisclosed assets. Daniel's answer had been short and final. She married me, not what I have. George had nodded and moved on. He was not there to give personal advice, but he kept from that day forward a file that he had labeled in his meticulous filing system simply with one word, Carol. He was not sure what was going to go in it yet. He just had a feeling that someday something would. The night they met, it was the 4th of July, 2001. A neighbor of Daniel's named Frank Kowalski was holding his annual cookout in the backyard of his house on Millbrook Lane, and Daniel went the way he always went to these things, briefly, without much expectation, planning to stay for an hour and leave before the mosquitoes got bad. He did not love parties. He was not unfriendly. But he was self-contained in the way that people who spend a great deal of time alone have become self-contained, comfortable in his own company, not particularly driven to seek out the company of others. He would eat, make conversation with Frank, and go home. That was the plan. Carol Hutchins was there because Frank's wife Diane had been pestering her for 3 weeks to come. Carol was 40 years old that summer, newly finished with a graduate education program that had kept her busy for the better part of 2 years, and recently and decisively out of an engagement that she did not like to talk about in detail, except to say that the man had turned out to be someone very different from who he had presented himself to be in the first 18 months of their relationship. She was tired in the specific way that being wrong about someone makes you tired. Not just emotionally exhausted, but philosophically worn down, questioning her own judgment, wondering if she was seeing clearly, or if she had some blind spot that prevented her from reading people accurately. She had agreed to the cookout partly because Diane was persistent, and partly because she had been spending too many evenings alone and knew it. She was standing by the drink cooler, holding a bottle of water and watching a dog chase a frisbee across the yard, when Daniel walked over to get a soda and said something unremarkable about the dog's commitment to the game. She laughed. He asked what she did. She told him she was a teacher. He asked what grade. 6th grade, she said. He asked what was the hardest part about teaching 11-year-olds. And she said, getting them to believe that the things they are learning matter before they have enough life experience to understand why they would. And he had nodded in a way that suggested he was actually thinking about her answer rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. She found this notable. They talked for 3 hours. She missed the fireworks display that Diane had been promising for weeks, because she and Daniel had drifted to the far end of the yard and sat on the fence and kept talking until it was dark, and the mosquitoes were in fact bad. She did not notice the mosquitoes. She called Diane the next morning and said, "Tell me everything you know about the landscaping man." What Diane told her was simple and consistent with what Daniel had presented. He was hardworking, reliable, quiet, well regarded by everyone who knew him. He had been a good neighbor for 6 years. He helped Frank with yard projects without being asked. He did not have a lot to say about himself, which Diane acknowledged could be read as either reserved or private, but which she personally read as someone who was comfortable with who he was and did not feel the need to perform for anyone. Carol thought about the conversation at the fence. She thought about the way he had asked questions. She called him the following Wednesday and asked if he wanted to get coffee. He said yes before she had finished the sentence. The architecture of the deception they dated for 2 years before Daniel asked Carol to marry him. In those 2 years, he was careful. More careful than Carol knew. More careful than even he fully acknowledged to himself. Careful in the deep-seated, automatic way that someone is careful when they have organized their entire psychology around a single overriding principle. The principle was this: Carol could never know about the money. Not yet. Not until he had decided it was safe. Not safe for the money, but safe for the relationship. Safe for the certainty he needed to feel that what existed between them was real and untouched by the thing that had the power to taint everything it touched. He took her on dates that were appropriate for a landscaper's income. He drove his truck. He wore the same clothes he always wore. He paid for dinner, but never in a way that suggested any kind of extravagance. He was, to all appearances, exactly who he appeared to be. He bought their house through a property holding company he had established years earlier, a simple LLC with a name that meant nothing to anyone who saw it on a document, one of 4 such companies. He used to hold his real estate assets in ways that kept his name at a remove from the paper trail. The purchase price was $214,000, paid in full, in cash. As far as Carol knew, they had applied for a mortgage, been approved, and were making payments of $1,200 a month to a lender whose name she saw on the automatic withdrawal from their joint checking account each month. The lender's name was real. It was a small regional bank. The account behind it was Daniel's. The $1,200 Carol was faithfully transferring every month was going, without her knowledge, into a custodial trust account that Daniel had established in the names of their 2 children, Thomas and Grace, who did not yet exist on the night he set the account up, but who he was already quietly planning for. The Saturday schedule established itself within the first year of their marriage and never varied. He left at 7:30 and was home by 5. He smelled like the outdoors when he came back. He had stories about clients, a backyard project in one neighborhood, a spring cleanup in another, a retaining wall that had taken longer than expected. The stories were specific enough to be plausible and vague enough that Carol never had cause to verify them. She had never once in 12 years called one of his clients on a Saturday to confirm he had been there. Why would she? She trusted him. That was the word she would use afterward, again and again, when she tried to explain how this had gone undetected for so long. Trust. Not naivety, not inattention. Trust. She had trusted him the way you trust someone who has given you no reason to do otherwise, which is the only real kind of trust, and which is also the thing that makes a sufficiently patient and careful deception essentially impossible to detect from the inside. The life Carol thought they were living, Carol managed the household finances with the diligence of a woman who had grown up, watching her parents make difficult choices about money and who had internalized, early, the understanding that financial safety was not something that happened to you. It was something you built deliberately and consistently. Through attention and discipline, she tracked every expense in a spreadsheet she updated weekly. She clipped coupons, not because she had to, but because she believed that the habit of careful spending was its own form of respect for the money you had worked to earn. She meal planned on Sundays for the entire week. She drove her Honda Civic until it had 140,000 miles on it, and the transmission went out on a Tuesday morning in the school parking lot, at which point she bought a used replacement, not new, used, because a new car seemed like an extravagance she could not justify. She worried about retirement the way responsible people worry about retirement, consistently, quietly, in the background of her thinking, as a low-level hum of concern that occasionally got louder when she read an article about how much the average American had saved versus how much they actually needed. She worried about the kids' college funds. She worried about whether their emergency fund was adequate. She brought these worries to Daniel from time to time, and he would listen, and he would say something measured and reassuring, and she would feel better. And she attributed his steadiness to his personality, rather than to the fact that he was sitting on a fortune that would have resolved every financial anxiety she had ever had without any difficulty whatsoever. She thought he was calm because he was a calm person. He was calm because he already knew everything was going to be fine. Those are very different things. What Carol did not know was that her teacher's salary, which she believed was the primary income supporting their family, was, from Daniel's perspective, essentially pocket money. Not because he was contemptuous of it. He was not contemptuous of it. He respected it deeply, in the same way he respected Carol's careful spreadsheet and her coupons and her used Honda, because these were expressions of the same values he had built his own life around. But the financial reality of their household was that Daniel's investment income alone, the dividends and rental payments flowing into accounts Carol had never seen, was generating more money every year than both of their salaries combined. The mortgage payments Carol was making every month were going into a trust for their children. The family was not, in any meaningful sense, living on what Carol thought they were living on. The family was, in fact, extraordinarily comfortable. Carol just did not know it. There was one moment, one single moment across 12 years, when Carol came close enough to the truth that it should have unraveled everything. She had found a bank statement in the mail, opened it reflexively because she handled all the household paperwork, and seen an account number she did not recognize, and a balance that gave her a moment of pause. She had asked Daniel about it. He had said it was an old account from before they were married that he had been meaning to close, that there was almost nothing in it, and that he would take care of it. She had accepted this, put the statement on the counter for him, and thought nothing more of it within a week. The balance on that statement was $460,000. It was, as Daniel would later explain with something between embarrassment and disbelief at his own audacity, one of the smaller accounts. A Tuesday morning in March, the morning that ended 12 years of silence, arrived the way most life-altering moments arrive. Not with any warning, not with any of the atmospheric preparation that you would write into a story if you were inventing one, but with the ordinary, unremarkable quality of a Tuesday in early March, when the weather does not yet decide what season it wants to be, and the light, through the kitchen window, is the flat gray light of a day that has not committed to anything yet. Carol Mercer was sorting the mail before school. She had 45 minutes before she needed to be in her car. The stack of envelopes was the usual composition of their Tuesday mail: a utility bill, a circular from a grocery chain she rarely used, a catalog for gardening supplies addressed to Daniel, and one envelope that she almost set aside without opening because the return address was unfamiliar, and the envelope had the look of institutional correspondence that was probably nothing. The weight of it made her hesitate. It was thicker than junk mail and the paper was heavier, the kind of envelope that costs more than the standard office supply variety, the kind that suggests that whoever sent it considers what is inside to be worth a certain quality of presentation. She opened it. Inside was a single document, a quarterly account statement from a private wealth management firm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The account holder name printed in clean dark type at the top of the first page was Daniel R. Mercer. The account type was Comprehensive Investment Management. And the current balance, as of the final day of the previous quarter, printed in a font that was neither large nor small, just the ordinary font of a document that dealt with numbers like this routinely and did not consider them remarkable, was $11,412,308. Carol read the number once. Then she read it again. Then she read it a third time, moving her eyes slowly across each digit as though the problem might be a misreading rather than a truth. As though if she was careful enough, she might find the decimal point in the wrong place, or a comma that did not belong, and the whole thing would resolve into something manageable. It did not resolve. The number was the number. She set the statement on the counter. She picked up her phone, she put the phone down, she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet below the sink, and she stayed there for 40 minutes without moving, with the statement on the counter above her, and the flat gray light coming through the window, and the sound of the refrigerator running and absolutely nothing else. She missed the staff meeting. She went to school anyway, arriving an hour late, and spent the day teaching long division to 31 sixth graders, with a smile so fixed and so deliberate that it ached in her jaw by noon. 3 of her students asked if she was okay. She told them she was fine. She was, by any meaningful measurement, as far from fine as she had been in 40 years of living. At lunch, she sat in her car in the school parking lot and called the wealth management firm from the number on the statement. A representative answered and confirmed, after asking for Daniel's date of birth and the last 4 digits of his social security number, both of which Carol knew without having to look them up because she was his wife of 12 years and she knew those things, that the account was real, active, and had been maintained at the firm for 11 years. Carol asked if there were other accounts. The representative said she could only speak to the account on the statement in front of her. Carol thanked her. She hung up. She sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, and then she went back inside and taught the afternoon session. That night she lay next to Daniel in their bed and listened to him breathe and thought about the money. She did not confront him that night. She was not ready. She needed to understand what she was feeling before she opened her mouth, because she was a woman who knew herself well enough to know that speaking before you understand what you are saying is how you say things you cannot take back, and she was not going to make that mistake. What she felt, lying there in the dark on her side of a bed she had shared with this man for 12 years, was not what she would have predicted if someone had asked her in the abstract how she would feel if she found out her husband had $11 million she did not know about. She had expected anger. She had expected to feel betrayed in a clean, clear way that she could name and point to and act on. What she actually felt was something stranger and more disorienting. She felt the ground shift underneath everything she thought she knew, not just about Daniel, but about herself, about her own perception, about whether the life she believed she had been living was the life that had actually been happening. The confrontation at the kitchen table, she waited one full day. She spent that day at school, and in the evening she went to the grocery store and came home and cooked dinner and sat across from Daniel while they ate and listened to him talk about a retaining wall he was pricing for a client in the Meadowbrook neighborhood, and she nodded. And she asked one or two questions, and she passed him the bread, and she cleaned up the dishes, and she was, throughout all of this, performing the most demanding role she had ever played, which was the role of a woman who does not know what she knows. She did it without flaw. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The following evening, she put the bank statement on the kitchen table after dinner. She smoothed it flat with her palm. She sat down across from Daniel, and she said his name, just his name, not a question, not an accusation. Just the word that was his name, said in the specific way that a person says a word when they want to make sure the other person is completely present before anything else happens. Daniel looked at her. He looked at the statement on the table between them. He did not reach for it. He did not try to minimize it or redirect the conversation or offer an explanation before she asked for one. He looked at her face, and the look on his face in that moment was something she would think about for years afterward. Not guilt, exactly. Not the expression of a man caught in something sordid, but something closer to a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has finally, with enormous ambivalence, been allowed to set it down. She said, "How long?" He said, "Since before we met." There was a silence that lasted long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and off in the other room. Then she said, "Everything." And he understood what she meant, and he nodded and he said yes. And then he told her. He sat at that kitchen table for 2.5 hours, and he told her everything. The portfolio, the properties, the 3 LLCs, George Atkins and the Saturday meetings in the office on 7th Street, the house paid in cash through a holding company, the mortgage payments going into the Children's Trust, the storage units in Parkersburg, the commercial building in Morgantown, the undeveloped land in the Eastern Panhandle. He told her the number, the real number, the total, which by that point was larger than the statement she had found, because that had been last quarter's figure, and the market had moved since then. He told her all of it, steadily, without making excuses in the middle of it, without pausing to explain or contextualize or soften anything, because he understood that what she needed first was the complete picture, and that explanations could come after. When he was finished, she sat for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Why?" And he told her about Raymond Mercer and the kitchen table, and the $3,000, and Earl Denton, who had never been found and never returned a dollar of what he had taken and had lived, for all Daniel knew, a perfectly comfortable life somewhere that was not Eastern Kentucky. He told her what he had decided at 14 years old in the hallway of his parents' house. He told her about the years of building alone, the discipline of it, the loneliness of it, the way he had kept the wall up even as it had become more and more difficult to justify keeping it up, even as the person on the other side of it was someone he trusted more than he had trusted anyone in his life. He told her he had been afraid, not of her, of what knowing would do, of whether the thing between them could survive the weight of that number, and Carol listened to all of it. She let him finish. And then she said the thing that Daniel Mercer would repeat for the rest of his life as the truest thing anyone had ever said. Directly to him, she said, "I understand why you are the way you are, but you did not make that choice for yourself. You made it for me. And you never asked." He did not have an answer for that, because there was not one what Carol found. When she started looking, Carol did not file for divorce that week. She did not call an attorney. What she did, beginning the morning after the kitchen table conversation, with the quiet, methodical energy of a woman who processes difficult things by understanding them completely before she decides what to do about them, was start going through the paperwork. Daniel's home office was a room she had always treated as his domain without thinking twice about it, a room she had never felt any particular reason to enter other than to hand him something or ask a quick question. The door was never locked. She had simply never looked. She went in on a Thursday morning before school, and she opened every drawer and every file cabinet, and she started reading. What she found was not chaos. It was not the disorganized evidence of a man with something to hide in the hasty, careless way that men in movies have something to hide. It was meticulous. It was organized in the way that a person organizes things when they intend for the organization to hold up for decades. Alphabetically within categories, each category clearly labeled, each document filed in chronological order within its folder. Nothing loose, nothing ambiguous, nothing that required any particular expertise to understand if you simply sat down with it and gave it enough time. Property deeds, LLC operating agreements, brokerage account statements going back to 1991, insurance policies on all 3 properties, tax returns, the real ones, not the simplified versions she had always seen, showing income that was, in the years she flipped through, between 4 and 10 times what she had understood their household to earn. And near the back of the bottom drawer of the rightmost filing cabinet, in a folder that was thicker than the others and labeled in Daniel's handwriting with a single word, her name, a trust document notarized in 2004, the year after their wedding. The trust was in her name. Carol Mercer, beneficiary. The amount, $2,100,000. Liquid and accessible upon her 50th birthday, which was 4 months away. She read it twice. She read the date it had been established, 14 months after they were married. She read the name of the trustee, George Atkins, and she recognized the name from something Daniel had mentioned years ago in passing, a tax accountant he used for the business. She read the document through to the end, and then she sat on the floor of Daniel's office with her back against the filing cabinet and the trust document in her hands, and she thought about the Saturday meetings. He had been going to see the man who held a $2 million trust in her name every Saturday for years, while she was home clipping coupons and updating her budget spreadsheet and lying awake at 3 in the morning doing retirement math. He had been sitting in an accountant's office managing a $2 million trust that he had set up for her benefit and that he had apparently intended to tell her about on her 50th birthday as some kind of, she could not find the right word for it, reveal, apology, gift. She genuinely did not know which one. Margaret's theory and what it led to Carol told her sister Margaret that weekend. She drove to Margaret's house in Bridgeport on Saturday afternoon and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, start to finish, while Margaret listened with the specific, focused attention of an older sister who has been waiting her entire adult life for her younger sister to need her in a serious way. When Carol finished, Margaret did not pause before responding. She said, "Carol, think about what you are describing. A man who hid money, a man who left the house every Saturday on a story you never questioned. You need to talk to a lawyer. And you need to find out what else he has been hiding. Because I can promise you that a man who is capable of this level of deception about money is a man who is capable of more than money." Carol did not dismiss this. She was too honest with herself to dismiss it outright, because the part of her that was still processing the shock of the previous week was capable of imagining the worst. She spent 2 weeks making inquiries that she is still, by her own account, somewhat embarrassed about. She called landscaping clients, several of them, under the pretext of asking about Daniel's availability and confirmed that yes, he did legitimate work for these people, that he had for years, that he was reliable and skilled, and they had never had any reason to question anything about him. She drove past the properties she had found in the filing cabinet and confirmed that they were what the documents said they were. A functional strip of storage units, a commercial building with tenants whose names were on the leases, an unremarkable piece of undeveloped land. She made one attempt to account for his Saturday whereabouts through a route she is unwilling to describe in detail, and found nothing. There was no other woman, there was no second family, there was no gambling or addiction or hidden crisis that the money was concealing. There was, as far as Carol could determine through 2 weeks of the kind of quiet investigation that a woman with her organizational skills and her attention to detail can conduct when she is highly motivated, nothing beyond exactly what Daniel had told her. A man who had built a fortune in secret and kept it there. That was all. That was, depending on how you looked at it, either a relief or its own kind of problem. Margaret, when Carol reported back, said, "The fact that there is nothing else is actually not the reassurance you seem to think it is. The deception about the money is the thing. You do not get credit for only lying about one thing," Carol said. "I know." But she was already starting, quietly, against her own better judgment, to think about what it meant that it was only one thing. The Scholarship Foundation. The discovery that altered the entire emotional architecture of the story came by accident in the third week of Carol's investigation. When she was going through Daniel's address book looking for contacts she did not recognize. There was an entry, James Whitfield, Parkersburg, with a phone number and no other notation, that she could not place in any context, from Daniel's landscaping work. She called the number expecting to reach a property tenant or a business contact. Instead, she reached a man who identified himself as the executive director of a small nonprofit organization called the Harlan County Futures Foundation, based in Parkersburg, but doing its work primarily in eastern Kentucky. She asked how he knew Daniel Mercer. There was a brief pause on the line, the pause of a man who was not sure how much he was supposed to say, and then James Whitfield told her. The foundation had been established in 2005. Its primary program was a college scholarship for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds in Harlan County, Kentucky. The scholarship was $12,000 per year, renewable for 4 years, awarded annually to 6 students. The funding came from a single anonymous donor who had never consented to be identified publicly and whose name did not appear in any of the foundation's public documentation. James Whitfield said he had met the donor once in person in the early days of setting up the foundation. He described him as a quiet man who did not want recognition, who had very specific ideas about how the scholarships should be structured, and who had said during their one meeting something that James had written down and kept. "I grew up there. I know what it costs a kid to believe there is a way out when everything around them is telling them there is not. I want 6 of them a year to know there is." The wire transfers came without fail, every year on the same date, the same amount. James Whitfield said that in nearly 20 years of running the foundation, he had never once had to follow up with the donor about a payment being late. He said that the students who had received the scholarship over the years, nearly 120 of them by that point, did not know, who had funded their educations. They knew only the foundation's name. He said that was how the donor had wanted it. He said he had thought about reaching out after Daniel's situation became locally known, small towns talk, and Clarksburg and Parkersburg were not so far apart, but that he had decided it was not his place. Carol thanked him and hung up. She sat in her car for a long time. She was thinking about something specific. She was thinking about a 14-year-old boy in a hallway in Harlan County, watching his father with his head in his hands at the kitchen table, and about what that boy had decided in that hallway, and about what he had spent the next 45 years doing about it. He had decided that money was dangerous. And then he had spent his entire adult life using money to do one of the most generous, anonymous, quietly transformative things she had ever heard of. He had never mentioned it, not once, not in 12 years of living with her. He had been sending 6 kids a year to college from the county where he grew up, and he had not said a single word about it to the woman sleeping next to him. She did not know what to do with that. She still does not know entirely what to do with that. George Atkins makes a call. Daniel had moved out of the house by the end of the 2nd week, not because Carol had asked him to leave exactly, but because she had said she needed space to think, and he had understood what that meant and had packed a bag without argument and taken a room at the extended stay on Route 50 without telling anyone where he was going except Carol and the children, who were 19 and 16 by this point, and who were handling the situation with the divergent reactions that children of the same family from different developmental stages tend to have toward parental crises. Thomas, who was 19 and had his mother's analytical intelligence and his father's tendency to feel things very deeply while saying very little about them, was furious in a way that ran cold rather than hot, steady and quiet and corrosive, the kind of anger that does not erupt but simply sits there radiating heat. Grace, who was 16 and had inherited something from both of them that neither of them had fully identified yet, went to see her father at the extended stay one evening without telling her mother she was going, sat with him for 2 hours, and came home and said to Carol, "He's not a bad person, Mom. He's just scared. He's been scared his whole life and nobody ever helped him with it." George Atkins called Carol on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week, not at Daniel's request, Daniel did not know George had her number in his files, and Daniel had not asked George to do anything except keep the accounts in order while things were unsettled. George had her number because he had kept it for 11 years as the kind of precaution that careful people take when they are holding something significant on behalf of someone else and want to make sure that the right person can be reached if the circumstances ever require it, he said to Carol, professionally and briefly. There is a document in my keeping that I believe you should be aware of. I am not able to describe it over the phone. Would you be willing to come to my office? She went the following morning. George Atkins's office was on the second floor of a building on 7th Street in Clarksburg, a small suite of rooms that smelled like old paper and wood smoke from a space heater that was clearly fighting a losing battle against a West Virginia march. George himself was a man in his early 70s by this point, precise and unhurried in the way of someone who had been doing exacting work for a very long time and had arrived at a relationship with accuracy that was beyond professionalism. It was closer to identity. He brought out a safe from the closet behind his desk. He used a combination that he covered with his hand out of habit, even though Carol was looking in a different direction. He removed a sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope, in Daniel's handwriting, was Carol's full name. On the back flap, also in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "For George, please give this to Carol if we divorce or if I die, whichever comes first." George handed the envelope to Carol. He said, "I have had this for 11 years, he said. Daniel gave me very specific instructions and I followed them, he said. I will leave you alone as long as you need." He went into the small conference room and closed the door behind him. Carol sat in his chair and held the envelope for almost 2 minutes before she opened it. What was inside the letter was 4 pages, handwritten in Daniel's careful, slightly compressed script. The handwriting of a man who did not write often but who wrote with total deliberateness when he did, who treated the act of putting words on paper as something that warranted the same patience and precision he brought to everything else in his life. The paper was standard-lined notebook paper, the kind you buy in any drugstore, which Carol found unexpectedly moving, that he had not gone out and bought special stationery for this, that he had reached for whatever was in the drawer and written what he needed to write without ceremony. He began by telling her that he knew, before he wrote a word of this letter, that there was nothing he could say that would make what he had done entirely right. He said that he was not writing this letter to justify himself, that he had spent 11 years knowing that what he was doing could not be fully justified, but because he wanted her, whenever she read this, to understand what had been true about him from the beginning, so that whatever she decided to do with that understanding would be made with the complete picture rather than with only the part that looked like a lie. He wrote about Raymond Mercer. He wrote about the kitchen table in Harlan County and the $3,000 and what it had done to a man who had spent his entire life being defined by his integrity, and about what it had done to a 14-year-old boy to watch it happen. He wrote about leaving Kentucky with $40 and the decision he had made on the drive out. Not the financial decision, the deeper one, the decision about who would be allowed to know what he was building, and why, and about the wall he had started constructing so early, that by the time he was 30, it felt less like a choice and more like a feature of who he was, the way some people are tall or left-handed, built into him at a level that was below the reach of ordinary reasoning. He wrote about meeting her at Frank Kowalski's 4th of July cookout. He described the specific moment, not the beginning of the conversation, but a particular moment in it, maybe 40 minutes in, when she had been explaining why a minor character in the book she was reading mattered, why the author had bothered with this person at all, when the main story didn't seem to need them, and her argument had been so precise and so genuinely thought through and so uninterested in whether he agreed with it that he had understood, sitting on Frank's back fence in the mosquito-heavy dark, that she was a person who paid attention to things that other people overlooked. He wrote that he had known in that moment that he was in serious trouble. He wrote that trouble was the right word for it, because loving someone when you have organized your entire life around not being known is its own kind of emergency. And then, near the end of the 3rd page, he wrote the thing that Carol would think about for years. He wrote, "I am more afraid that you will leave me when you find out I am wealthy than I ever was, that you would leave me if I were poor. Because you married me when you believed I had nothing extra to give you. You chose me as I appeared to be, a man with calloused hands and a used truck and lunch. He packed himself and nothing about him that would make a Women choose him for any reason other than the fact that she actually wanted him. And if you leave me now, after finding out the truth, then I will know that I was right to be afraid, that the knowledge changes something, that it was not possible to be seen the way I needed to be seen. But if you stay, then I will know, for the rest of whatever time I have, that what we built was real in a way that I was not capable of trusting until it survived this. I know that is not fair. I know I had no right to arrange the test without asking you if you consented to take it. I have known this for years. I did not know how to fix it. I am deeply sorry for every evening you worried about money while I lay next to you and said nothing. I am sorry for every dollar you stretched that did not need stretching. I am sorry for pretending. I am not, and I cannot make myself be, sorry for having loved you as honestly as I knew how. That part I would not take back, even now. Even if you cannot forgive the rest. Carol folded the letter carefully. She put it in her purse. She sat in George Atkins' chair for another 5 minutes, and then she knocked on the conference room door and told him she was leaving. He nodded. She went down the stairs and out to her car, and she sat there for a long time in the parking lot on 7th Street. Then she called her sister. She read Margaret the last 3 paragraphs of the letter over the phone, her voice steady until the second to last sentence, which was where it stopped being steady. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment that was longer than Margaret's silences usually were. Then she said, "Carol, that is either the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my life, or the most sophisticated piece of manipulation I have ever encountered, and I genuinely cannot tell which." Carol said, "I know. That is exactly the problem." And then neither of them said anything for a while, and the line stayed open between them, and the March afternoon light came through Carol's windshield and made everything look a little warmer than it was. Carol Mercer took 10 days. She packed a bag on the Sunday after her visit to George Atkins's office and drove to her sister's house in Bridgeport and stayed there for a week. Margaret did not push her. That was the right thing to do, and Margaret, who could be a pusher in ordinary circumstances, seemed to understand that this was not an ordinary circumstance, and that what Carol needed was proximity to someone she trusted and the freedom to think without being asked every hour what she had concluded. Margaret made food. She kept the television on in the evenings at a low volume. She did not ask Carol what she was going to do. She waited. Carol's days during that week had a structure to them that she imposed deliberately because she was a woman who understood that structure was how she kept herself functional when the emotional ground was unsteady. She woke early. She went for long walks in the neighborhood around Margaret's house in the morning before the traffic got heavy, following the same route each day because the predictability of the route was itself a comfort. She had called her therapist, a woman named Dr. Sandra Cole, whom she had seen briefly 5 years earlier during a period of related stress and to whom she had not spoken since, and Dr. Cole had an opening on Tuesday and Thursday. Carol went both days. She did not tell Dr. Cole what to think about any of it. She just talked in the way that good therapy allows you to talk, following the thread of what she actually felt rather than what she thought she was supposed to feel. And Dr. Cole listened and occasionally said something that helped Carol see what she was already thinking from a slightly different angle. She talked to Thomas on the phone on Wednesday. He was at college 2 hours away, and she had called him the week before to tell him that she and his father were working through something difficult and that he should not worry. And he had, of course, immediately worried and called back 3 times in the next 2 days until she had told him more of what was happening. Thomas had the reaction of a young man who loves his mother and who has not yet lived long enough to hold 2 contradictory truths about a person at the same time with any comfort. He said his father had lied to them. He said it was not just about the money. It was about what the lying meant. It was about the fact that none of them had been allowed to make choices with full information. He said, "Mom, you spent your whole adult life worrying about whether we had enough, and he was sitting there letting you worry. How do you forgive that?" Carol said, "I don't know yet. That's what I'm working on." And he said, "I don't know if I can." And she said, "That's okay. That's yours to work out in your own time." Grace was different. Grace had already seen her father at the extended stay and had come home from that visit quieter than she had left and unwilling to be specific about what had been said, which Carol respected because 16-year-olds are entitled to their private conversations with their parents even in crisis. But one evening during that week, Carol was on the phone with Grace, and Grace said something that stayed with her. She said, "Mom, I think Dad has been scared his whole life, and I think he thought hiding it would protect us. I think he was wrong about how to do it. but I don't think he was wrong about wanting to protect us. There is a difference between being wrong about the method and being wrong about the intention. Carol had gone quiet on the phone after that, and Grace, who was 16 and therefore occasionally wiser than any of them, had simply said, "I love you. Call me tomorrow." On the 8th day, Carol drove back to the house in Clarksburg. Daniel was not there. He was still at the extended stay and had been scrupulous about not contacting her beyond 2 brief text messages checking in, both of which she had answered simply to confirm she was okay. She walked through every room alone. She stood in the kitchen where she had found the bank statement on the counter a month ago. She stood in Daniel's office with its meticulous filing system. She stood in the backyard and looked at the roses he had been trimming the morning. Before all of this began, the morning she had been watching him from the kitchen window with a coffee cup in both hands and a smile on her face, certain that she knew exactly who she was married to. The roses needed attention. It had been a month. She went inside and she picked up her phone and she called Daniel and she said, "Come home." The kitchen table, again he was there within the hour. He came in through the front door and he stood in the hallway looking at her in the kitchen doorway. And there was a moment, just a moment, a few seconds long, where neither of them moved and neither of them spoke, and the house around them held the particular quality of stillness that a space holds when it is waiting for the people in it to determine what it is going to become. Then she said, "Sit down," and he sat, and she sat across from him, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him on the night she put the bank statement on the table, except that this time what she was looking for was something she had already found, something she had spent 10 days turning over in her hands trying to understand from every angle. She said, "I spent 10 days trying to decide whether what you did was forgivable. And what I realized is that I cannot actually answer that question in the abstract because forgiving someone is not a conclusion you reach by thinking about it long enough. It is something you choose, and then you keep choosing every time it becomes difficult again. So I am not going to tell you that I have forgiven you. I am going to tell you that I am choosing to stay, and that staying means I am choosing to try. And what trying looks like from this point forward is everything, every account, every property, every meeting with George Atkins, every financial decision from now on is a decision we make together. You do not get to decide what I know about our lives. You do not get to protect me from information that is mine to have. That is finished. Do you understand that?" And Daniel said yes, without hesitation, without condition, without asking for anything in return, just yes. She told him she was also going to need him to understand something else, which was that the apology she was owed was not a one-time event. That there would be days, she could not tell him when, they would arrive without announcement, when she would feel the full weight of what he had kept from her, and she would need him to sit with that without defending himself. She would need him to understand that she was not reopening the argument. She was just feeling the thing, and he would need to let her feel it without making it about his intentions or his fear or his father or Harlan County, because all of those things were real and all of those things mattered, and none of them, not a single one, erased the fact that she had lain awake at 3 in the morning doing retirement math while $11 million sat in an account with her husband's name on it. He said he understood. He said he was sorry, not for the first time. But it landed differently this time, in the way that apologies land differently when the person hearing them has decided to receive them. They sat at that kitchen table for another hour after that, not talking about the money or the deception or any of the specific events of the past month. Just talking, the way they had always talked, about small things and the children and a book she had been reading, with the specific ease of 2 people who have known each other for a long time and who fit together in conversation in a way that is not common and that you lose sight of when everything is broken open, but that returns when you are paying attention, like a physical thing you can feel in the room. That ease was still there. That was the thing she had been sitting with for 10 days. The ease was still there. And she had decided that the ease mattered, the America that Daniel Mercer came. I have been thinking about Daniel and Carol Mercer for a long time now, turning the story over in the way that you turn over a story that does not resolve cleanly, looking at it from different angles and testing it against different frameworks and arriving, each time, at the same uncomfortable conclusion, that there is no version of this story in which everyone is right or simply wrong, and that the discomfort of that is actually the point. We live in a country with a complicated and largely unexamined relationship with money. We do not talk about it at dinner. We do not tell our neighbors what we earn. We do not, as a cultural habit, reveal the full picture of our financial lives even to the people we are supposed to be closest to, because we have absorbed a set of beliefs about money that run so deep they feel like common sense. That wealth invites envy, that poverty invites pity, that talking about either one makes you either arrogant or pathetic, and that the safe position is simply to keep the whole subject as private as possible. These are not laws. They are not even really principles. They are reflexes, and they are so widespread and so normalized that we rarely stop to examine what they cost us. What they cost Daniel Mercer, specifically, was the ability to be fully known by the person he loved most. He had internalized those reflexes so completely, had built such an elaborate and self-reinforcing structure of reasons to keep the secret, that by the time he met Carol and began to genuinely love her, the wall was no longer a choice he was making. It had become a feature of his architecture, something he would have had to dismantle deliberately and with enormous difficulty, and something that dismantling felt more dangerous than maintaining.
This is not an excuse.
But it is an explanation, and explanations, even when they do not excuse, matter for understanding what we are actually looking at. The story of Ronald Reed came to mind when I first heard about Daniel Mercer, and the parallel has stayed with me throughout. Ronald Reed was a Vermont man, a gas station attendant and a part-time janitor at a J.C. Penney, who died in 2014 at the age of 92 and was discovered to have quietly amassed a fortune of $8 million over the course of his lifetime through decades of disciplined saving and patient investing in solid established companies that he understood and held for years without selling. His stepson told the press that the family was, quote, tremendously surprised. A friend who had known him for years said he was a hard worker, but that nobody had any idea he was a multimillionaire. Ronald Reed drove a used Toyota. He held his coat closed with safety pins. He had his English muffin and coffee every morning at the same diner and never gave anyone any reason to look twice at him. He left $8 million to a local hospital and library when he died. He was, in the way that the phrase is usually used without quite meaning what it says, the millionaire next door. What I find haunting about Ronald Reed and about Daniel Mercer is not the money itself, but the discipline of the concealment. Both men spent their entire adult lives building something enormous and keeping the existence of it almost entirely private, not because they were ashamed of it, or because they had done anything wrong to acquire it, but because they had internalized at a foundational level the belief that the money was separate from who they were and that revealing it would contaminate the identity they had built around the version of themselves that was not wealthy. They wanted to be known as the man who showed up and worked and was reliable and genuine and present. They were terrified that the money would replace that man in other people's eyes. And they were not entirely wrong to be afraid of that. Money does change the way people see you. It does alter relationships. The fear was real. What was not acceptable, in Daniel's case particularly, where another person's daily life was organized around a false set of facts, was the decision that the fear entitled them to control what the people closest to them were allowed to know. Because here is the thing about financial concealment inside a marriage, and the reason that this story matters beyond the specific details of one couple in Clarksburg, West Virginia. It is far more common than most people want to acknowledge. Research into what has been called financial infidelity, the hiding of accounts, income, debt, or financial decisions from a spouse or partner, has found consistently that it affects a significant portion of married Americans. The motivations are varied. Sometimes it is control, sometimes it is shame, sometimes it is fear of judgment, sometimes it is the specific, hard-to-articulate desire that Daniel Mercer articulated so precisely in his letter. The desire to be loved for something other than what you have, to be chosen without the complication of the money being part of the choosing. None of these motivations make the concealment acceptable. What they do is make it human. And understanding that it is human is the beginning of understanding how to talk about it honestly, which is the only way any of this gets better. What Carol says. Now, Carol Mercer went back to her therapist every week for a year. Daniel joined her for couples counseling sessions every other week for 6 months. Thomas came around slowly. It took nearly a year before he could sit in the same room as his father, without the anger visible in his posture. And even now, the relationship between them carries a quality of carefulness that was not there before. Grace, as it turned out, was the most perceptive person in the family, which surprised no one who knew her well. She told her school counselor something that the counselor found significant enough to write down. The thing nobody is talking about is that my dad has been afraid his whole life and nobody ever helped him with it. The school counselor shared this, with Grace's permission, at a family session about 6 months into the process. Daniel had listened to it and not said anything for a long time. Then he said she is not wrong. Daniel sold the commercial building in Morgantown. He kept the storage units and the land, which Carol understood as investments rather than secrets after she had reviewed all the documentation. He transferred the deed on their house out of the LLC and into their joint names, which she had insisted on and which he had done without argument within the week she asked. Every financial account, everyone, including the smaller ones she had not known existed, was added to a shared spreadsheet that both of them could access at any time. She reviewed it monthly. He did not question the review. He actually, by Carol's account, seemed relieved by it, as though the structure of transparency that she had imposed was something he had needed someone to make him build for years, as though the keeping of the secret had been a weight he had been carrying so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The trust that had been established in her name in 2004 became accessible on her 50th birthday in July of that year. He had made a reservation at a restaurant in Morgantown, the kind of place they had never gone during their marriage because it was too expensive, a point that now carried an irony that both of them were capable of laughing at, though it had taken some months to get there. He gave her a card at the table. Inside it, he had written one sentence, "Happy birthday. Now you know everything." She had read it and looked at him across the table and said, "You are going to have to do better than that." And he had laughed, the first real laugh she had heard from him in months, open and without qualification. And she had laughed too, and the people at the adjacent tables had glanced over at the sound of it. Two people in their 50s laughing at a restaurant table like something had just been released. I want to sit with you for a few more minutes before this ends, because I think what Daniel and Carol Mercer's story asks of us is something more than just an opinion about one couple's situation. I think it asks something about how we understand love and privacy and the specific, irreducible harm of making someone else's choices for them especially when you believe you are doing it out of care. There is a version of Daniel Mercer that is easy to sympathize with, a man shaped by genuine trauma, who built something extraordinary through discipline and patience and sacrifice, who was afraid, legitimately afraid, rooted in real experience, that wealth would change the way the people closest to him saw him, and who tried, imperfectly and ultimately wrongly, to protect the love he had found from the thing that had destroyed his father's sense of self. That version of him is real. The fear is real. The intentions, as much as intentions can be read from the outside, appear to have been genuine. The scholarship foundation is real. The trust fund is real. The letter is real. None of that is performance. All of that is evidence of a man who was trying, in the only way he knew how, to do right by the people he loved. And then there is the other version. The version that Carol articulated at the kitchen table, with quiet, devastating precision. You did not make that choice for yourself. You made it for me, and you never asked. That version is also real. Whatever Daniel's intentions were, the daily reality of their marriage was that Carol Mercer was living inside a set of facts that were not true. Her financial anxiety was real anxiety, felt in real time, affecting real decisions, coloring real nights. Her careful spreadsheet and her coupons and her used Honda and her retirement math at 3 in the morning, all of it was genuine. All of it was Carol doing what a responsible person does when they believe they are in the financial situation they believe themselves to be in, and all of it was unnecessary in a way she did not know. He had taken from her, without asking, the ability to make fully informed choices about her own life, not dramatically, not maliciously, quietly, daily, for 12 years. That is not a small thing. It does not become a small thing because the letter was beautiful. So where does that leave us? I genuinely do not know. I have told you this story as honestly as I can tell it, which means telling you both versions and refusing to resolve the tension between them by deciding which one wins. Because I do not think one wins. I think both are true simultaneously. In the way that complicated human situations are often made up of multiple truths that do not cancel each other out, but simply exist alongside each other, requiring us to hold them both at once, even when that is uncomfortable. Daniel Mercer was shaped by something real and tried to love someone genuinely and failed her in a specific and significant way while doing it. Carol Mercer was wronged in a specific and significant way and chose, with full knowledge of what she was choosing, to stay. Both of those things are true. Both of those people are real. Here is the question I want you to take with you. Think about the people you are closest to. Think about how much of what you know about them is the complete picture, and how much of it is the picture they have decided for whatever reason to show you. And think about this. When does keeping something private become deciding for someone else what they are allowed to know? Because that line between privacy and control, between protecting someone and managing them, between a secret kept out of fear and a secret kept out of love that is impossible, from the inside, to tell apart, that line is not always where we think it is. And the people most at risk of crossing it are not the ones who mean harm. They are the ones, like Daniel Mercer, who mean the opposite of harm so completely that they convince themselves the crossing is kindness. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching this from, your city, your state, wherever you are tonight. And then tell me, if you were Carol, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Would the letter have changed it for you, or would it have made it worse? The idea that he had been sitting with this for 11 years, that he had written it all down and sealed it, and handed it to an accountant like a contingency plan for the love he was not sure he had earned. Because I think the letter is the most interesting part of this story, and I want to know what it does for you. I read the comments on every video, every single one. Your perspective on this matters to me, and I want to know where you stand. Before you go, if this is your first time on this channel and something about this story reached you, hit that subscribe button. Because the stories we tell here are not summaries. They are not takes. They are attempts to get as close as possible to the truth of what happened, between real people in real situations, and to ask the questions that those situations raise without pretending that the answers are simple. That is what we do here. That is all we do here. And if that is the kind of storytelling you came for, I will see you in the next one. This was the story of Daniel and Carol Mercer, the man who grew up watching money unmake the most dignified person he knew, and who spent the next 45 years trying to build a life where that could never happen again. The man who was wrong about the method. The man who was, in the deepest possible sense, right about the fear. And the woman who understood both of those things well enough to choose, not to forgive in a single clean gesture, not to erase what had been done, but to stay, to keep choosing, to decide day by day that what was real between them was worth the difficulty of what came next. That is a harder kind of love than the kind that does not get tested. It is also maybe a truer one. I will see you in the next one.